The morning sun spilled across the quiet streets of Oceanside, California, brushing gold over the small diner that sat a few blocks from Camp Pendleton. Ellie's Cafe, the kind of place where time moved slow, where the smell of coffee and old stories filled the air thicker than the smoke from the grill. Inside, the bell over the door jingled as another rush of Marines in crisp uniforms stepped in, their laughter cutting through the soft hum of an old jukebox. Most were young, fresh from boot camp, full of noise and untested pride. At the corner table near the window sat a man alone. He wore a simple brown jacket, its fabric faded from years of wear. Propped beside his chair were a pair of worn aluminum crutches. His left pant leg was neatly pinned just below the knee. He didn't draw attention to himself, didn't need to. He just sat there, sipping black coffee, eyes steady, face unreadable. Behind the counter, Ellie, the cafe owner, a woman who had served Marines coffee for 30 years, gave him a warm nod. "Morning, Mr. Walker," she said softly. He nodded back. "Morning, Ellie." His voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd seen chaos and survived it. At the far booth, one of the young Marines, tall, square-jawed with a sharp buzz cut, noticed him. The recruit elbowed his buddy, smirking. "Check it out," he whispered. "Old-timer with crutches. Bet he tells war stories for free coffee." The others chuckled. Their voices rose a little louder than they should have. Ellie's eyes flicked toward them in quiet warning. Mr. Walker didn't react. He'd learned long ago that silence spoke louder than confrontation. He took another sip of coffee, eyes drifting toward the sunlight sliding across the diner floor. But the recruit wasn't done. "Hey, sir," he called out, grinning. "You lose that leg serving coffee or in combat?" A few Marines laughed, short, awkward bursts. Even they weren't sure it was funny. Ellie froze mid-wipe, her cloth hovering over the counter. The air thickened instantly. Walker set his cup down gently. Then he turned his head slowly until his eyes locked with the recruit's. "No," he said evenly. "Lost it, saving men who thought war was a joke." The laughter died. The sound of the jukebox felt distant now, like a heartbeat slowing down. The recruit shifted, his smirk faltering for just a second. "Hey, I didn't mean anything by it," he said quickly, waving a hand. "Just kidding around." Walker gave a small nod. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's how most people talk before they learn what pain really costs." For a moment nobody moved. The silence pressed heavy on the air. Ellie stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "You boys watch your mouths. That man's earned his peace." The young Marine looked down at his coffee. His friends avoided his gaze. The laughter that had filled the room minutes ago was gone. Walker reached for his wallet to pay the bill. As he leaned forward, the edge of his jacket shifted, revealing a patch sewn into the side. It was small, faded, but unmistakable. The eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps, surrounded by golden stitching and a black border that read, "Force Recon, 3rd Marine Division." The recruit froze, his breath caught. He'd seen that emblem before, not in real life, but in the halls of the base museum. It belonged to an elite brotherhood. Men trained for missions that rarely made it to the news, men who disappeared into darkness so others could come home. "Force Recon," he whispered. Walker looked up at him again, eyes calm, steady. "Yeah," he said, "that's the one." The young Marine swallowed hard. His throat was dry. He didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. Ellie placed a gentle hand on Walker's shoulder. "You take care, James," she said softly. He gave a faint smile. "Always do." As he pushed himself up, balancing on his crutches, every movement carried quiet dignity, the kind that didn't need applause. The sound of metal tapping the tile echoed through the cafe. When the door closed behind him, the room remained still. The recruit finally exhaled. "Ellie," he said quietly. "Who was that man?" Ellie's eyes stayed on the window, watching the old Marine move down the street, sunlight glinting off the emblem on his jacket. "That," she said softly, "was Captain James Walker. Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, Force Recon legend. Saved 12 Marines in Helmand Province after his unit was hit." The recruit's stomach sank. His hands trembled slightly around the coffee mug. He had laughed at a man who once carried the weight of others' lives through fire. Outside, the sound of Crutches faded down the street, each step a quiet echo of honor that didn't need to shout. The young Marine whispered to no one in particular, "Semper Fi, sir," and for the first time in his life, he meant it. The following morning, the base was quiet. The coastal fog rolled low over Camp Pendleton, swallowing the distant hum of morning drills. Private Ryan Miller, the same recruit who had laughed the day before, sat on the edge of his bunk, staring down at his boots. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the old man's steady gaze. Those eyes weren't angry, they were worse, disappointed. The kind of disappointment that digs into your gut, because you know you earned it. He rubbed his face and sighed. "Force recon," he muttered under his breath. The words still sounded unreal. How had he not known? How could he have been that blind? Corporal Evans, his roommate, walked in, half-dressed and chewing gum. "You look like you saw a ghost," Evans said, smirking. Miller didn't answer. Evans raised an eyebrow. "What's up with you?" Miller exhaled. "Remember that guy at Ellie's cafe yesterday? The one with crutches?" "Yeah, the one you mouthed off to." Evans grinned. "Man, that was awkward. You froze up fast." Miller's jaw tightened. "That guy was Captain James Walker, Force Recon, Silver Star. He saved 12 Marines in Helmand." Evans's gum stopped mid-chew. "No way." "Ellie told me," Miller said quietly. "Said he lost his leg pulling men out of a burning convoy." The corporal let out a low whistle. "Damn, you really picked the wrong man to joke with." "Yeah," Miller muttered. "Tell me about it." For the rest of the morning, the base seemed heavier. Every salute, every order, every march echoed differently in Miller's head. The words "Semper Fidelis," always faithful, weren't just a motto anymore. They were a mirror. By noon, he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to find him, needed to apologize, not to clear his conscience, but because something inside told him that men like Walker deserved better than silence. He found Ellie wiping the counter again when he walked back into the cafe. She looked up, surprised. "Back already, Marine?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Miller said, standing straight. "Do you know where I can find Captain Walker?" Her eyes softened. "He doesn't come around much anymore. Yesterday was the first time I'd seen him in months." "Please," Miller said, his voice low but earnest. "I need to make things right." Ellie studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded toward the window. "He lives on 8th and Harbour," she said finally. "Small house near the docks. You'll know it when you see the flag." The wind off the ocean carried salt and memory as Miller made his way down the narrow street. Old fishing boats rocked gently against the pier, their ropes creaking like tired bones. He saw it before he reached the house. The flag, faded but clean, flying proudly in front of a small, weathered home. The sound of seagulls circled overhead. Miller hesitated at the gate. He felt like a trespasser, standing on the ground of a man who had already given more than he ever could. Then the door opened. Captain James Walker stood in the doorway, steadying himself with one crutch. The sunlight caught the silver in his hair. "Can I help you, Marine?" Walker asked, his voice calm but watchful. Miller straightened instinctively. "Sir, Private Ryan Miller, Camp Pendleton." He swallowed. "I wanted to apologize for what I said yesterday. It was out of line, sir." Walker studied him for a long moment, the kind of silence that tests a man's sincerity. "Why?" he asked finally. "Because you feel guilty? Or because you learned something?" Miller blinked. "Both, sir. But mostly because I realized I disrespected something I don't even understand yet." Walker's gaze softened slightly. "Sit down, son." They sat on the porch, the ocean breeze carrying the faint cry of gulls and the rhythmic clang of the harbor bell. "You remind me of me," Walker said after a moment. "Before I knew what it cost." Miller frowned. "Sir?" Walker leaned on his crutch, staring out at the waves. "You join the Corps thinking you'll be the hero of your own story. Then you learn the truth. Heroes don't come home in the same skin they left in." The young Marine swallowed hard. Ellie told me what happened in Helmand, sir. Walker's lips curved faintly. People tell stories. They forget the smell, the sound, the weight. He tapped the crutch against the wood. You don't lose your leg in battle. You lose it every time you wake up and remember who didn't make it. Miller didn't know what to say. He just sat there, silent, letting the words carve into his chest. After a while, Walker stood. You said you wanted to make it right. Yes, sir. Then don't waste the chance you've got. Learn what it means to wear that uniform, not for the medals, for the men who can't. Miller nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Walker looked down at him. Good. Then we're done here. As Miller stood to leave, his eyes caught something on the porch wall. A framed photograph. A younger Walker, surrounded by his squad, dirt-streaked and grinning. In his hand, he held a Marine Corps flag. Half the men in that picture never came back. Miller turned, saluted sharply. Thank you for your service, Captain. Walker gave a faint smile. Thank you for remembering. That night, back on base, Miller sat by the window of his barracks, watching the fog drift over the lights of the town. He felt different, not heavier, just aware. The next morning, he ironed his uniform twice, shined his boots until they caught the reflection of the sun, and when he walked into Ellie's cafe again, he didn't laugh or talk loud. He simply looked at the empty seat by the window, the one Walker used, and whispered under his breath, Semper Fi, sir, I'll carry it right this time. 2 weeks passed before anyone at Camp Pendleton mentioned Captain James Walker again. But for Private Ryan Miller, the old Marine was never far from his thoughts. Every time he shouldered his rifle, he remembered that quiet voice saying, Don't wear the uniform for the medals. Wear it for the men who can't. Every morning when the bugle called Reveille, he stood a little straighter, not because someone told him to, but because he understood now what the salute meant. Then, one morning, the company commander stepped into formation holding a clipboard. Listen up, he barked. Base Command has confirmed that next Saturday's memorial ceremony will honor local veterans. Volunteers will assist the parade committee. Miller's hand shot up before his brain even caught up. Yes, Private? Sir, I'd like to volunteer. The officer nodded. Good. Report to Sergeant Major Collins for assignment. As the formation broke, Evans slapped Miller on the shoulder. You volunteering for extra work, man? You're losing it. Miller just smiled faintly. Maybe. Or maybe I'm trying to earn back what I took for granted. Saturday came bright and clear, the kind of morning that felt carved for remembrance. Rows of flags lined the street, fluttering in the ocean breeze. Old Marines stood proudly in their dress blues, medals glinting against their chests like captured sunlight. Miller's job was simple: help veterans to their seats, ensure the path was clear, and salute each as they passed. But his eyes kept scanning the crowd, hoping for a glimpse of one man. And then he saw him, Captain James Walker, dressed sharp in a clean Marine jacket, a single crutch under his arm, his Silver Star ribbon pinned above his heart. Every head seemed to turn just slightly as he made his way down the aisle. The younger Marines didn't even know who he was, but something in his bearing made them straighten up instinctively. Miller moved quickly, stepping forward. Captain Walker, he said, saluting. Walker looked surprised for a second, then smiled faintly. You again? Yes, sir. Private Miller. Glad to see you here. Walker's tone was dry. Couldn't avoid it. Ellie said they were serving free coffee. Miller laughed, the kind of laugh that carried respect this time, not arrogance. Well, sir, it's an honor to have you here. Honor's just a word, Walker said softly. Actions are what count. The ceremony began. The bass band played the Marines' hymn, and the air filled with pride and memory. A general took the stage to speak of sacrifice, brotherhood, and duty. Miller stood at attention beside the path, but his gaze drifted again to Walker, sitting quietly in the third row, head bowed slightly. When the general finished, a major stepped forward with a list. Today we also recognize one of our own, a Marine who served with unmatched valor in Helmand province, who, despite injuries that ended his active service, continues to embody the spirit of the Corps. The crowd stirred. Murmurs rippled through the ranks. The major's voice carried across the parade ground. "Captain James Walker, United States Marine Corps, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts Force Reconnaissance Division." Applause erupted, the kind that starts slow, then rises like thunder. Every Marine stood. Even those too young to know the story felt the weight of it. Walker froze, eyes flickering between pride and disbelief. He hadn't expected this. "Captain Walker," the major said, "on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, we honor your service and your silence. For your courage, your sacrifice, and your example, we present this commendation of continued valor." The young Marine helping him up was Ryan Miller. Walker looked at him, the faintest of smiles ghosting across his face. "You planned this?" Miller shook his head. "No, sir. I just made sure they remembered." Walker hesitated, then rose slowly on his crutch. The applause rolled across the parade ground like a wave. He stood tall enough that for a moment nobody noticed the missing leg, only the man who had given everything and asked for nothing. When the cheering faded, Walker leaned toward Miller and said quietly, "Guess ghosts don't stay buried forever." Miller answered, "Not the kind that carried the flag, sir." That night, the base canteen was loud again, but this time it wasn't laughter at someone's expense. It was joy, pride, and unity. Stories of Walker spread fast, told and retold, until his name became more than a legend. It became a lesson. Miller sat by the window, staring at the flagpole outside, where the stars and stripes fluttered under floodlight. Evans approached, handing him a beer. "So, you really tracked down a war hero, huh?" Miller nodded slowly. "No, I just found a Marine who never stopped serving." Weeks passed since the ceremony, yet the echo of applause still lived inside the walls of Camp Pendleton. For many, the day had been another event to mark on the calendar. But for Private Ryan Miller, it had become a turning point, a dividing line between the Marine he had been and the Marine he was trying to become. Every morning he ran the track before sunrise, every drill, every inspection. He gave more than what was asked. Not to impress, but to honor. He often caught himself whispering the old motto under his breath, "Semper Fidelis," always faithful. But something else had begun too. Captain James Walker had started showing up at the base's rehabilitation wing twice a week. Officially, he was volunteering. In truth, he was helping young Marines learn how to live with the injuries they carried home from deployment. Word spread quickly. The legend who had vanished after Helmand was back, not to fight, but to teach. When Miller heard, he didn't hesitate. He showed up on the first day. The rehab center smelled of antiseptic and determination. Rows of treadmills, weights, and parallel bars lined the room. At the far end, Walker stood beside a young corporal learning to balance on a prosthetic leg. His crutch leaned against the wall. His hands were steady. His voice was calm. "Don't look down," Walker said. "You'll fall where your eyes go. Keep your head up, always forward." The Marine stumbled once, caught himself, and then stood tall. Walker smiled faintly. "There you go. You just learned the hardest lesson in the Corps. Staying up when the world's trying to knock you down." When the session ended, Miller approached. "Captain Walker." Walker turned, recognizing him instantly. "Private Miller, still trying to make things right?" Miller nodded. "Yes, sir. Thought maybe I could help here. Carry supplies, clean up, whatever you need." Walker studied him for a moment. "You don't owe me anything, son." Miller met his gaze. "Maybe not, sir, but I owe what you stand for." Walker's silence lasted long enough to count as an answer. Finally, he nodded toward a stack of folded towels. "Start with those." Over the next few weeks, Miller became a fixture at the rehab center. He didn't just work. He listened. To Walker, to the men who came limping in with scars visible and invisible. He learned that heroism wasn't about medals or glory. It was in the quiet moments, when Walker steadied a Marine's hand, or when he spoke to a broken man like he still mattered. Once, late in the afternoon, Miller asked, "Sir, why do you still come here? After everything?" Walker took a long breath, eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the window. Because the fight doesn't end when the shooting stops. You don't stop being a Marine when they take your weapon. You just start fighting different battles. Miller swallowed the lump in his throat. What about your battles, sir? Walker's lips curved faintly. They're quieter now, but they never really go away. For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of someone's prosthetic steps across the floor. Then Walker said something that Miller never forgot. Every scar you earn in the service stays with you. The trick isn't to hide them, it's to teach others what they cost. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the base, Miller saw Walker sitting alone outside the center, his crutch resting beside him, a mug of coffee in hand. "Permission to sit, sir?" Miller asked. Walker nodded. "It's a free country, at least it used to be." Miller chuckled softly, then grew serious. "They're talking about you again on base, saying you turned down another medal." Walker didn't look up. "Medals don't make you whole. They just shine where something broke." Miller hesitated. "Still, sir, people should know." Walker finally turned toward him. "They will, when men like you remember." That night, as Miller walked back through the quiet base, he realized something profound. He had started this journey trying to apologize for one mistake, but now he was learning what it meant to live by the creed. Walker hadn't just taught him respect, he had shown him how to carry it. And in that realization, Miller knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new legacy, one built not by battles, but by brotherhood. The morning fog drifted across the base like an old ghost refusing to leave. The flagpole outside the rehabilitation center gleamed under a pale sunrise, its fabric rippling softly in the breeze. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and disinfectant, and of quiet perseverance. Captain James Walker sat near the window, his Marine Corps jacket draped carefully over the back of his chair, the same jacket that bore the eagle, globe, and anchor patch, the emblem that had once silenced a young recruit. He looked thinner these days. The long years and the old wounds had begun to catch up to him, but his voice still carried the same steel it always had when he spoke. Private Ryan Miller walked in, now taller somehow, not in height, but in bearing. The months of service, training, and reflection had changed him. He carried his uniform with pride, but also humility. "Morning, sir," he said, placing 2 cups of coffee on the table. "Figured you'd be here before me." Walker smiled faintly. "You figured right." They sat in silence for a moment, sipping coffee, watching the flag outside sway like a heartbeat. "You're leaving soon," Walker said finally. "Yes, sir. Deployment to Okinawa in a week." Walker nodded. "You ready?" Miller hesitated, then said quietly, "I think so. I know what it means now." Walker studied him, pride hidden behind the calm of his eyes. "You've learned fast." Miller looked down at the jacket. The golden thread of the Marine emblem caught the morning light, glowing like a quiet flame. "Sir," he asked softly, "why do you still keep that jacket? After everything?" Walker leaned back, his gaze distant. "Because it reminds me of the ones who didn't get to come home to hang theirs up," he said. "Every stitch on that emblem is a memory, and memories, they're heavier than medals." Miller swallowed hard. "You think I'll ever earn something like that?" Walker turned to him. "You already have, the moment you chose to respect what it stands for." The room fell quiet again. Outside, a group of young Marines jogged past, their cadence echoing faintly. "One shot, one kill, ready to fight, ready to die." Walker smiled faintly. "They sound like I used to." Miller smiled back. "You think they'll remember your name, sir?" Walker's eyes softened. "Doesn't matter if they remember my name, as long as they remember the code." That evening, Ellie's cafe was fuller than usual. The base had sent out word, a small informal gathering to celebrate Captain Walker's service before Miller's unit shipped out. The old Marine wasn't fond of ceremonies, but Ellie had insisted. When he arrived, the room stood in silence for a heartbeat, then broke into respectful applause. Walker chuckled. "You clap for me, you better buy the next round," he said. Ellie laughed through tears. still sharp as ever. As the evening went on, Miller stood and cleared his throat. The room quieted instantly. "Sir," he said, looking at Walker, "you once told me heroes don't come home in the same skin they left in. You also told me that scars aren't something to hide, but to teach with. Tonight we're not just honoring a Marine, we're honoring the lesson he left in all of us." He turned to the crowd. "Captain James Walker taught me what Semper Fi truly means. Not just loyalty to the Corps, but loyalty to the people who make it worth fighting for." The applause was long, heartfelt, raw. When it faded, Walker slowly reached for his jacket. His hands shook slightly as he held it out toward Miller. "This belonged to a generation that learned the hard way," he said softly. "Now it belongs to the next one." Miller froze. "Sir, I can't," Walker interrupted. "You can. Because one day some kid will laugh at you the way you once laughed at me, and when he does, you'll show him this." The young Marine took the jacket, hands trembling. The weight of it wasn't just fabric, it was history. Walker smiled, eyes glinting with the warmth of an old fire. "Take care of it, son." Miller saluted sharply. "Aye, sir." Months later, somewhere far from home, the Marine emblem gleamed again, this time on Miller's shoulder. The wind of the Pacific carried the same rhythm, the same spirit. He stood by the barracks window one night, staring at the stars, whispering the words that had come to define him. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. And though Captain James Walker was gone now, the jacket still carried the story. A story of honor, humility, and the unbroken chain of Marines who never stopped standing, even when the world knocked them down. The ocean stretched wide and endless that morning, its waves rolling in with the slow rhythm of breath. The pier at Oceanside was nearly empty, except for one figure standing at the end, Private Ryan Miller. Now Sergeant Miller, his uniform crisp, his eyes steady on the horizon. It had been 2 years since Captain James Walker's funeral, 2 years since the taps had played softly over the sea, and the folded flag had been placed in Ellie's trembling hands. The cafe still stood, though quieter now. Ellie had framed Walker's photograph near the register, the one of him smiling faintly, his crutch beside him, and the Marine jacket on his shoulders. Beneath it, a small brass plate read, "Always faithful, Captain James Walker, USMC." Miller visited often. Sometimes he'd bring recruits from the base, young men loud with energy, to show them the picture and tell the story. Most of them went silent when he finished. Today was different, though. Today wasn't for lessons. It was for remembrance. Miller reached into a small box he carried and unfolded the old Marine jacket. The threads were frayed now, the fabric softened by years of wear, but the emblem, the eagle, globe, and anchor, still gleamed faintly under the morning sun. He ran his fingers over the stitching, feeling the ghost of the man who once wore it. "Morning, Captain," he said softly. "Thought I'd take you for one last walk." He draped the jacket over the pier's railing, the wind catching it just enough to make it flutter like a living thing. For a moment, it looked as though it was saluting the horizon. Miller stood at attention. The waves crashed below, steady and powerful, like the heartbeat of something eternal. "You taught me more than the Corps ever could," he said. "You taught me that real strength isn't standing tall, it's standing true, even when no one's watching." His voice trembled slightly, but he kept it steady. "Semper Fi, sir." He held the salute for a long time, long enough that a few passers-by stopped, watching quietly. They didn't know who he was saluting. They didn't need to. When he lowered his hand, he carefully folded the jacket and placed it back in the box. Then he walked toward the end of the pier and set it gently on the bench that faced the sea. The wind shifted, and for a moment he could almost hear Walker's voice again, calm, dry, with that faint humor that had carried him through hell and home again. "Don't look down, son. Always forward." Miller smiled faintly. "Aye, sir." He turned and walked back toward the shore, boots thudding softly against the wooden planks. Behind him the ocean kept moving, endless and patient, just like the memory of the men who had once stood its watch. That evening, back at the cafe, Ellie found the box on her counter. Inside lay the jacket neatly folded and a handwritten note in Miller's careful script. He carried this for all of us. Now it's time for it to rest where his story began. Ellie placed it in a glass case near the window, where the sunlight could catch the golden thread of the emblem every morning. And there it stayed, a quiet relic of sacrifice, brotherhood, and the kind of faith that never dies. Years later, new recruits would still stop at that cafe. Some came by accident, some by word of mouth. They'd see the old jacket behind the glass, the brass plaque beneath it, and they'd ask Ellie who it belonged to. And she'd smile softly, wiping her hands on her apron before answering, "That jacket. It belonged to a Marine who taught the world what honor really means." Then she'd look toward the sea, where the horizon still shimmered like memory, and add, "and to a young man who proved that lessons like that never fade." The sun was low over the Pacific, turning the sky into a canvas of gold and crimson. The waves rolled in with a slow, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. A decade had passed since Captain Walker's death, but his name still lived quietly in corners of the Corps. New Marines spoke of him in fragments, the man who came back when he shouldn't have, the one who taught respect without saying much at all. But for Sergeant Ryan Miller, the legend was never about the stories. It was about the silence. He now served as a drill instructor. His voice carried power, but his presence carried something deeper. Every morning before the recruits arrived on the field, he would take a moment by the flagpole, one hand over his heart, the other touching the patch sewn onto his jacket, the same emblem that once made him fall silent in a cafe. The same emblem Captain Walker had handed him, saying, "Show them what it means." That morning, the recruits lined up on the field, a new generation, young, restless, unaware that history was watching them. Miller paced before them, eyes sharp, tone firm. "You think being a Marine is about looking tough," he barked. "About medals and muscles." No one answered. He stopped in front of a nervous young private, barely 19, freckles under his helmet. "You think you can stand tall until the world hits you in the knees, boy? You think you can carry your brothers when your legs don't work anymore?" The recruit swallowed hard. I don't know, sir." Miller's voice lowered, steady and calm. "Then learn." He turned toward the flag, the wind tugging at the corners of his uniform. "Because one day, the only thing between you and the dark will be the name on your chest and the promise behind it." He looked back at them, his gaze unflinching. "Semper Fi isn't a slogan. It's the reason we come home, and the reason some don't. Silence, the kind that makes men remember." Then, from the edge of the field, a group of officers approached. Among them, Colonel Harris, now greyer, slower, but still commanding. "Sergeant Miller," Harris said. "We'd like to have a word." Miller straightened. "Yes, sir." The colonel gestured to the recruits. "At ease, men." Then he turned to Miller with a faint smile. "You've been doing good work. Word travels. They say you've changed how the recruits see the Corps." Miller said nothing. Harris continued, "Command has approved a dedication, a memorial wing at the Rehabilitation Center, for Marines who taught others what courage really means." He handed Miller a small velvet box. "They asked me who should present it. I said the only man who understood him." Miller opened the box. Inside, gleaming beneath the morning light, was a medal, engraved with 2 words, "For faith beyond duty." Beneath it, a name, Captain James Walker. Miller's throat tightened. "Sir, I don't deserve—" "You're not receiving it," Harris said softly. "You're delivering it." Later that afternoon, Miller stood once again at the rehab center, the same place where Walker had spent his last years. The hall was filled with veterans, young Marines and quiet civilians who had come to remember. At the front stood a small glass case. Inside, Walker's crutch, his photo, and the old Marine jacket, now perfectly preserved. Miller stepped to the microphone. His voice was steady, but the emotion beneath it was unmistakable. "Captain James Walker once told me that scars aren't things to hide. They're things to teach with. I didn't understand it then. I do now. He looked at the rows of men and women who had served, because every one of us carries something invisible, a pain, a memory, a weight. And what makes us Marines isn't how we fight. It's how we live with what fighting costs. He paused, then lifted the medal high for all to see. This isn't for one man. It's for every Marine who ever stood when he could have stayed down. For every brother and sister who never stopped being faithful. The audience stood. The sound of hands coming together filled the hall, soft at first, then rising, rolling like thunder. Miller turned toward the glass case. The jacket's emblem glinted under the lights. For a moment, he could almost see Walker's reflection. That same half-smile, calm and knowing. Miller raised his hand in a slow salute. "Mission complete, sir," he whispered. A breeze moved through the open door, fluttering the flags that lined the walls, as though the Corps itself was answering. Semper Fidelis. Outside, the sun dipped low over the ocean, painting the world in amber light. The waves moved with eternal patience, washing over the shore the way time washes over names, gently but never erasing them completely. And far in the distance, the sound of gulls echoed faintly, almost like laughter. Or maybe it was just the wind carrying the voice of a Marine who had never really left.